McCluskey banks hard, following that white wake northeast. His fuel situation has crossed from critical to suicidal. Behind him, 31 aircraft follow without hesitation, though turning back would leave the torpedo squadron's sacrifice without tactical result. The dive bomber trailing McCluskey's wing carries technology that will achieve high hit rates against maneuvering warships in conditions where other delivery systems have struggled. But first, these pilots must find their targets before their engines drink the last gallon of aviation fuel sloshing in their wing tanks. Torpedo Squadron 8's pilots flew their approach knowing they would die. Commander John Waldron led his 15 aircraft straight into the teeth of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, holding course at 40 knots above stall speed while Zero fighters queued up behind them like wolves culling a herd. The torpedo bomber required a final approach of 1,000 yards, nearly a full minute of straight and level flight at 100 knots, while concentrated Japanese anti-aircraft fire tracked them. The Mark 13 torpedo demanded release at exactly 50 feet altitude and 110 knots airspeed. Release parameters were narrow. Too fast, and the torpedo's nose would buckle on water impact, while excessive altitude caused porpoising or deep running. The delivery window was measured in seconds, and Japanese gunners had been practicing against exactly this attack profile for years. Ensign George Gay's aircraft was hit during the final approach, and he ditched near the Japanese fleet. He was the sole survivor. His torpedo, like the others launched that morning by Torpedo 8, either missed or malfunctioned. The Mark 13's magnetic exploder experienced high failure rates during the Midway attacks. When it did function, the torpedo ran so slowly, 33 knots, that any carrier captain with functioning rudder could simply turn away from the track. The British had tried to solve this problem with the ferry Swordfish at Taranto, achieving spectacular results against anchored ships in harbor. But Taranto's targets weren't maneuvering at 30 knots with fighter cover overhead. When Swordfish attacked Bismarck in the open Atlantic, they scored exactly one critical hit out of multiple strikes, and that hit came from an aircraft so slow the German fire control couldn't track it properly. American torpedo doctrine had no such accidental advantage. The torpedo bomber was fast enough to track, slow enough to catch, and required an approach geometry that gave defenders maximum engagement time. At Midway, 3 torpedo squadrons attacked in sequence. Torpedo 8, 15 aircraft, 0 hits, 1 survivor. Torpedo 6 from Enterprise, 14 aircraft, 0 hits, 4 survivors. Torpedo 3 from Yorktown, 12 aircraft, 0 hits, 2 survivors. 41 torpedo bombers, 0 hits, 35 aircraft destroyed. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, Zeros from all 4 carriers, had descended to sea level to slaughter the torpedo bombers. They were still there, low on ammunition, separated from their ships by 14,000 feet of altitude, when McCluskey's dive bombers arrived overhead at 15,000 feet. The mathematics of dive bombing had been dismissed by theorists for a decade. A bomb falling from 15,000 feet would accelerate to terminal velocity, but wind drift, aircraft vibration, and human error compounded across those 3 miles of descent. Pre-war calculations suggested hit rates below 10% against maneuvering targets. The Navy's General Board had recommended canceling dive bomber procurement entirely in 1939, arguing that torpedo attack represented the only viable method of delivering ordnance against armored warships. What the theorists missed was the dive itself. A pilot pushing over into a 70-degree dive wasn't dropping a bomb from 15,000 feet. He was flying his aircraft toward the target until the last possible moment, releasing at 1,500 feet after tracking the ship's evasive maneuvers through his entire descent. The bomb didn't drift for 3 miles. It fell for 4 seconds. Wind correction happened continuously during the dive, not as a single calculation before release. The pilot maintained continuous aim adjustment throughout descent, compensating for target movement in real time. The steep dive angle reduced the targeting problem to a direct aiming solution rather than a complex ballistic calculation. The perforated dive flaps that extended from the trailing edge of each wing limited terminal velocity to 276 knots, fast enough to complicate anti-aircraft tracking, slow enough to maintain control authority. The pilot could adjust his dive angle, compensate for target movement, and place his aircraft directly above the enemy ship's predicted position at release altitude. But this required an aircraft that could survive the dive. The stress loads at pullout from a 70-degree dive exceeded 6 Gs. Wings designed for level flight would fold. Control surfaces designed for cruise would lock solid in the transonic buffet zone. The airframe had to be overbuilt to a degree that made it heavy, slow, and vulnerable in any other flight regime. Every structural member was reinforced beyond normal requirements. Every control surface was balanced for high-speed authority. Procurement boards looked at the specifications and saw an aircraft that couldn't outrun fighters, couldn't outclimb interceptors, couldn't carry enough fuel for extended searches. They saw a weapon system optimized for a single moment, the dive, at the expense of every other combat requirement. They recommended torpedo bombers instead, faster, longer-ranged, carrying a weapon with 10 times the explosive power. McCluskey's fuel gauge showed 18 minutes when he spotted the Japanese carriers. 4 fleet carriers in a box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed for a second strike against the American fleet. The Zeros were still at sea level, climbing desperately, but too late. The anti-aircraft directors were still depressed for torpedo attack, their crews frantically cranking elevation wheels as the first dive bombers pushed over. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's dive bomber squadron against Soryu. His aircraft had accidentally released its bomb during the approach, an arming mechanism malfunction, but he led the attack anyway, drawing fire while his wingmen dove. 3 bombs struck Soryu's flight deck in 45 seconds. The first penetrated to the hangar deck and detonated among fully fueled aircraft. The second struck the forward elevator. The third exploded in the island structure. McCluskey's pilots split between Kaga and Akagi. 4 bombs hit Kaga. 2 hit Akagi, including one that penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the hangar among torpedo bombers being armed with their own weapons. The sympathetic detonations of Japanese ordnance turned both carriers into floating infernos within minutes. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterstrike that crippled Yorktown. But that afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu and put 4 bombs into her flight deck. The Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. American dive bombers had achieved what 41 torpedo bombers could not. They had won the Battle of Midway. The hit rate at Midway exceeded 40% in many cases, against maneuvering targets, under fire, with pilots who had never attacked a defended carrier before that morning, and the Navy still wanted to replace it. The aircraft looked like it belonged in a museum before the war even started. Fabric-covered control surfaces, fixed landing gear hanging below the fuselage like an afterthought, a greenhouse canopy offering visibility at the cost of aerodynamic efficiency. When the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics convened in early 1941 to assess carrier aircraft requirements, the evaluation board recommended immediate replacement. The Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver promised 50 knots more speed, internal bomb carriage, and folding wings that would double carrier capacity. Production orders went to Curtiss. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was marked for phase-out by mid-1942. Yet 18 months later, it remained, still diving on Japanese shipping, while the Helldiver accumulated 880 engineering changes and a reputation for killing its own crews in training accidents. The Douglas SBD Dauntless that the Navy tried to retire had become an effective ship killer in the Pacific theater, achieving consistently higher hit rates than level bombing and proving more reliable than faster torpedo attack. The Douglas SBD Dauntless specifications told a story of deliberate compromise. The Wright R1820-60 Cyclone radial produced 1,200 horsepower. Adequate, not exceptional. Maximum speed reached 255 miles per hour at 14,000 feet, slower than most fighters by 1940 standards. Combat radius extended to 250 miles with a 1,000-pound bomb, limiting strike range. Empty weight of 6,535 pounds and maximum takeoff weight of 10,700 pounds classified it as a medium dive bomber. Wingspan measured 41 feet 6 inches, length 33 feet, height 13 feet 7 inches. Two forward-firing .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns in the engine cowling provided offensive armament, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc at 750 rounds per minute each. The rear gunner operated twin .30 caliber Brownings on a flexible mount with 2,000 rounds total. The answer lay in those perforated split flaps, hydraulically operated surfaces that deployed to 60 degrees, creating drag without the buffeting that plagued conventional dive brakes. The 47 square feet of drag surface allowed pilots to push into 70-degree dives while maintaining 276 knots terminal velocity. Steep enough to minimize exposure, slow enough to aim. The Aichi D-3A Val that devastated Pearl Harbor carried comparable ordnance, a 550-pound bomb on the centerline, two 132-pound bombs underwing. Its dive brakes limited angles to 55 degrees before control forces exceeded pilot capability. That 15-degree difference meant the Val spent 4.2 additional seconds in the effective envelope of shipboard anti-aircraft fire. At typical engagement ranges during carrier battles, Japanese 25mm Type 96 guns achieved low single-digit hit probabilities per second of tracking time. Those extra seconds translated to measurably increased vulnerability before bomb release. The mathematics of accuracy proved equally decisive. From a 70-degree dive initiated at 15,000 feet, an SBD pilot had 18 seconds of controlled descent to refine aim using the Mark 8 reflector sight. The sight projected an illuminated reticle onto a glass plate, allowing the pilot to track the target while maintaining dive angle reference. Unlike level bombing, where bombardiers calculated wind drift, airspeed, and altitude through complex mechanical computers, dive bombing reduced the problem to pointing the aircraft at the target and releasing at the correct altitude. Circular error probable from 2,500-foot release altitude under combat conditions at Midway measured approximately 35 feet. This meant 50% of bombs fell within a 35-foot radius of the aim point. A Japanese carrier flight deck measured approximately 850 feet by 95 feet. The probability of a single bomb striking that deck from an SBD dive was high. Level bombing from B-17 at 20,000 feet produced a CEP of 1,200 feet, requiring statistically 48 aircraft to achieve the same hit probability as a single dive bomber. The Curtiss SB-2C held diver that was supposed to replace it finally reached combat squadrons in November 1943. Pilot accounts and squadron reports documented persistent handling problems. Its higher wing loading of 49 pounds per square foot compared to the Dauntless's 35 pounds created vicious stall characteristics in the dive. Early held divers suffered structural failures of the tail section during pullout. The -1 variant was restricted from combat pending 880 modifications. Meanwhile, SBDs continued flying from escort carriers through 1944, their obsolete design proving more reliable than its replacement. The limitations were real and honestly acknowledged by the crews who flew them. Range-constrained tactical options, the 250-mile combat radius meant carriers had to close within Japanese land-based air coverage to launch strikes. The fixed landing gear created 40 knots of parasitic drag, making escape from fighters nearly impossible. Losses at Midway included 14 SBDs from the morning strikes alone. The rear gunner's twin .30 caliber provided minimal deterrent against determined fighter attack. The 1,877 feet per second muzzle velocity and 30-gram projectiles lacked the stopping power of heavier weapons. Crews knew they survived by completing their dives before interception, not by fighting their way out. Captured Japanese naval intelligence assessments documented the institutional response. Following Midway, Combined Fleet Headquarters issued revised anti-aircraft doctrine emphasizing barrage fire over aimed tracking, an implicit acknowledgement that the steep American dive angles defeated conventional gunnery solutions. Carrier Air Group commanders received instructions to prioritize interception of dive bombers over torpedo aircraft, reversing pre-war doctrine that considered torpedoes the primary threat. The phrase Jijangsha Baogeki, dive bomber, appeared in after-action reports with increasing frequency, often accompanied by assessments of the high accuracy that had gutted 4 fleet carriers in minutes. The wake still pointed northwest. McCluskey's formation had followed it for 35 minutes before the carriers appeared. Now, pulling out of his dive at 1,500 feet, the geometry that Doctrine had dismissed proved itself in flame and secondary explosions. Akagi burned from hangar deck to bridge. Kaga listed as aviation gasoline ignited across 3 decks. The Douglas SBD Dauntless the Navy had scheduled for retirement had just reversed the Pacific War's trajectory. The Douglas SBD Dauntless achieved at Midway what faster aircraft and heavier weapons could not. It put bombs through flight decks when the battle's outcome hung on that single capability, proving that an aircraft optimized for the dive could deliver decisive results despite limitations in speed, range, and defensive armament.